January 26. Itimbabe Bashawu. 4 in the morning. The city of Khartoum falls. The forces of the Mahdi, the man who had declared himself the long-awaited Messiah of Islam 4 years earlier, pour through the walls. The British had been telling themselves for 4 years that he couldn't possibly hold his state together, couldn't possibly defeat a modern army, couldn't possibly be what he said he was. General Charles Gordon, the British commander, is killed on the steps of the Governor-General's palace. Accounts of his death vary. Some say he was shot. Some say he died sword in hand on the stairs. The specific version depends on who is telling the story and what they need Gordon's death to mean. What's not disputed, he was dead before the relief force arrived. The relief force arrived 2 days later. In London, Queen Victoria was furious. She sent an unciphered telegram meaning anyone could read it to Prime Minister Gladstone, expressing her displeasure at the delay that had cost Gordon his life. The telegram was so harsh that it had to be delivered by a railway porter rather than an official, so that the porter, not the official, would have to hand the Prime Minister a document from his Queen that treated him like a negligent employee. Gladstone's government fell within months. The Victorian press turned his initials into an accusation. M.O.G. Murderer of Gordon. The newspapers called the Mahdi a fanatic, a fraud, a primitive religious hysteric, leading a rabble of desert tribesmen. He had just driven the most powerful empire on earth out of its entire position in East Africa, with no artillery, no formal military training, no state structure that the British recognized as a state. He had to claim one specific, ancient, deeply rooted prophetic claim, and a population that had been waiting for a very long time for someone to make it convincingly enough. Before we go further, one thing needs to be said directly. This season has examined several different prophetic frameworks: Manifest Destiny, the 1,000-Year Reich, and now this. The analytical frame being used is the same across all of them. Our prophetic language fills a gap, provides legitimacy, and becomes difficult to falsify. That frame is useful precisely because it applies across different contexts. But the same analytical frame does not mean the same moral weight. These cases differ enormously in who holds the power, who bears the costs, and what gets done in the name of the prophecy. A colonial subject claiming divine mandate to resist occupation is not the same as a state apparatus using prophetic rhetoric to justify conquest or genocide. The structure can be similar. The ethics are not. Episode 3 shows you what this particular structure looks like with almost none of the resources Episode 2 described. No searchlights, no cameras, no Riefenstahl, no printing press, a man with no army, no state, no newspaper, just a claim and a population with genuine grievances and an existing framework of expectation that had been building for centuries. Same analytical structure, opposite power relationship, very different consequences. First, a word that's going to come up constantly this episode: Mahdi. In Arabic, Al-Mahdi means the guided one. In Islamic religious tradition, it carries a more specific weight referring to a figure expected to appear before the end of times. A leader who will emerge from obscurity, unite the Muslim world, establish justice after a long period of oppression, and reign before the day of judgment. Here is where the history gets immediately complicated, and where it's worth pausing. The Mahdi is not mentioned by name in the Quran. The concept developed across the early centuries of Islam through hadith sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. These sayings describe the Mahdi's characteristics in varying degrees of specificity: that he would share the Prophet's name, that he would be descended from the Prophet's family, that he would appear in a time of Muslim suffering under foreign powers. But the hadith tradition is not monolithic. Different schools of Islamic jurisprudence have weighted the relevant hadith differently. Some have considered the Mahdi expectation well established. Others have treated it with skepticism. The descriptions themselves vary across different collections, and the level of detail, including geographic specificity, differs significantly depending on which texts you're reading. This matters because what follows is a story about how a specific man made a specific claim, and how that claim landed with remarkable force in a specific time and place. It landed partly because of what people believed, and partly because of what they were experiencing. Separating those two things, the theological from the political, is harder than it looks. With that in mind, in Sudan, in 1881, across the communities where Ahmad ibn Abdallah was known and would eventually be heard, the expectation of a Mahdi was genuinely present. It was part of the religious vocabulary people carried, and the conditions it described: oppression, foreign domination. The corruption of Muslim governance were not abstractions. To understand why 1881 felt, to many people, like a moment the old prophecies had been describing, you have to understand what the preceding decades had actually looked like from inside the Muslim world. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled the Muslim heartlands from Istanbul to Baghdad for 5 centuries, and whose sultan held the title of caliph, spiritual leader of the global Muslim community, had spent the 19th century in visible, humiliating retreat. It had lost Greece in 1821. It had lost Romania, Serbia, Montenegro, and Bulgaria in 1878. European creditors controlled Ottoman finances. European powers dictated Ottoman foreign policy. The authority was still formally there. The reality behind it was hollowing out. Egypt had gone further and faster. The Khedive had borrowed so heavily from European banks that by 1875 he was forced to sell Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal to Britain. By 1879, he had been deposed by the European powers. By 1882, Britain had bombarded Alexandria and occupied the country outright. And Sudan, below Egypt, on the Nile, was being administered by this British-controlled Egypt as an extraction territory. The tax collectors were brutal. The slavers operated with official tolerance. The local population had no meaningful voice in who governed them or how. This is the context into which Muhammad Ahmad's claim arrived. Whether you read the prophecies as literally foretelling these conditions, or whether you read them as a framework that people reached for when the conditions became unbearable, that's a question about interpretation. What isn't in question is that for many people in Sudan in 1881, the gap between what Islamic tradition promised and what daily life actually delivered was enormous and getting larger. The prophecy didn't create that gap. The gap was already there. The prophecy gave it a name, and a shape, and crucially a direction. Ahmad ibn Abdallah was born in 1844 on Aba Island in the White Nile, into a family that claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad. His father was a boat builder. He was extraordinarily devout from childhood. He trained within the Sufi brotherhoods, the mystical orders that were the dominant form of popular Islam in Sudan for centuries. By his mid-30s, he had a reputation as a holy man of unusual spiritual intensity. People came to him for guidance. He was also furious. What Muhammad Ahmad was furious about was the Turco-Egyptian administration that controlled Sudan. The tax collectors were brutal even by the brutal standards of colonial tax collection. Slavers operated with official tolerance, and local religious leaders, in his view, had accommodated themselves to the foreign administration in ways that compromised the faith. In 1881, on Aba Island, something happened. Muhammad Ahmad told his closest followers that he had received a vision. The Prophet Muhammad had appeared to him, and the Prophet had told him that he, Muhammad Ahmad, The boat builder's son from Abba Island was the expected Mahdi, the guided one, the one the prophecies had been describing. He had arrived. What happened next moved faster than the Egyptian government expected. The government sent soldiers to arrest him. Muhammad Ahmad had approximately 300 followers at this point, mostly unarmed. Farmers, students, local men who had been drawn to his teaching. Against them came a force of Egyptian soldiers with modern rifles sent to put a stop to what Cairo understood as a local religious disturbance. The soldiers were defeated. This needs a moment. A religious teacher on a river island, with 300 followers carrying spears and sticks, defeated a force of trained soldiers with modern weapons. It happened partly because of tactical surprise, partly because of the particular courage of people who genuinely believe they are fighting on the side of divine justice, partly because the Egyptian soldiers weren't especially motivated to die for a tax collection system far from home. The victory was not a miracle. It was a military outcome with explicable causes. But within the framework that Muhammad Ahmad was offering, a framework many of his followers already inhabited, the victory was confirmation. The Mahdi was supposed to prevail. He had prevailed. The prophecy was not being tested. It was being fulfilled. This dynamic where early victories provide evidence that reinforces belief, which in turn sustains the movement through harder times, is worth understanding clearly. It is not unique to this case. It appears in the history of religious movements across many traditions and centuries. What made the Mahdi's case distinctive was the speed at which it accelerated, and the scale of the political vacuum it moved into. The name Muhammad Ahmad gave his followers was Al-Ansar, the helpers, the same term used for the early converts who had supported the Prophet in Medina. The choice was deliberate and legible to anyone who knew Islamic history. This was not just a rebellion. It was, in its framing, a reenactment, the foundational moment of Islam happening again. Here, now, on the Nile. The followers were not an undifferentiated mass. Sufi scholars came with theological reasons for accepting the claim. Farmers came who had experienced the Egyptian tax system directly and needed no theological argument. Traders came who had watched Egyptian mismanagement disrupt their livelihoods for years. They arrived from different backgrounds, different classes, different relationships to religious tradition. What held them together was not a single shared ideology so much as a convergence of grievances and a framework that gave those grievances direction. After the first victory, Muhammad Ahmad sent letters to religious and tribal leaders across Sudan. The letters were careful. They didn't simply announce that he was the Mahdi. They described the conditions the Mahdi's arrival was meant to address: the corruption, the oppression, the compromise of the faith, and then announced that the remedy had arrived. The Mahdi was not a candidate for a position. He was an answer to a situation. The letters moved through Sufi networks, the relationships between teachers and students, traders along the Nile, pilgrims going to and from Mecca. Not fast. The speed of a letter on a camel in the Sudanese desert is not fast. But the network was trusted in a way the Egyptian telegraph could not replicate. The telegraph could relay a military order from Cairo to Khartoum in minutes. It could not make a Sudanese farmer believe the Mahdi had arrived. That required a different kind of transmission. By the end of 1881, the Ansar numbered in the thousands. By 1882, in the tens of thousands. Men walking hundreds of miles across the desert to join a movement that offered them, for the first time in a long time, a framework in which their suffering was not simply the condition of their lives, but the specific oppression that a long-expected justice was about to correct. You didn't walk hundreds of miles for better wages. You walked because you believed the waiting was finally over, and you were not going to be the person who wasn't there when it happened. The claim Muhammad Ahmad was making differs in important ways from the other cases this season has examined. O'Sullivan invented a phrase. Mola Vandenbroek wrote a book. These were new formulations, vocabularies constructed and applied to existing anxieties. Muhammad Ahmad didn't invent anything. He claimed to fulfill something, a specific expectation that had been documented in his tradition for centuries, with specific criteria, specific signs, specific conditions. The expectation was already there. The relevant communities already had a sense of what the Mahdi's arrival was supposed to look like and what conditions were supposed to precede it. He was not asking people to believe something new. He was asking them to recognize that what they already believed was now, finally, happening. That is a different kind of claim, and in some ways a more powerful one because the infrastructure of belief is already built. You don't have to convince people the Mahdi matters. The question is only whether this particular man is the one. How did Muhammad Ahmad persuade them? Partly through his personal qualities. Eyewitness accounts consistently describe a man of extraordinary physical presence and spiritual intensity, someone whose certainty was contagious in the specific way that genuine conviction tends to be. Partly through visible signs. He claimed birthmarks described in the prophetic literature had physical characteristics associated in some traditions with the Mahdi, and maintained a discipline of fasting and prayer that made his claim credible to people who understood devotion as evidence of spiritual status. But mostly, as we've noted, he won. In the broader Islamic tradition, divine appointment has often been understood as verified by results. The Mahdi was supposed to prevail against oppression. Muhammad Ahmad prevailed against every force sent against him. Every Egyptian regiment that retreated or surrendered was the prophecy fulfilling itself in real time at least. That was how it was read within the movement. Whether the victories caused the belief to deepen, or whether the belief caused people to fight in ways that produced the victories, is not a question with a clean answer. Both things were probably true, in different proportions, for different people. By mid-1822, the Egyptian government had sent multiple military expeditions into Sudan. Every one had failed. The Mahdi's forces had captured Egyptian weapons, supplies, and uniforms. They were, in a very practical sense, being rearmed by the army trying to suppress them. William Hicks was a British officer serving the Egyptian Khedive. In November 1883, he led a force of roughly 10,000 soldiers deep into Sudan, tasked with finally crushing the movement. The Mahdi's forces drew his column away from the Nile and the water it represented, then attacked from multiple directions when the column was exhausted, thirsty, and strung out over miles of featureless ground. Of Hicks's force, approximately 500 men were killed or captured. The Mahdi's forces took the expedition's weapons, supplies, and artillery. The news reached London on November 23. Ichimbabe Bashasan. The Times described it as a catastrophe without parallel. London could no longer call this a local disturbance. The man who had started with 300 spearmen on a river island had, in 2 years, destroyed 2 major military expeditions. He had built a following that stretched across Sudan and was still growing. Now Britain had to decide what to do about it. Charles George Gordon was, in 1884, the most famous soldier in the British Empire. He had fought in the Crimea and in China in the Second Opium War. He led a force called the Ever-Victorious Army that helped suppress the Taiping Rebellion. He had been Governor-General of Sudan for the Egyptian Khedive in the late 1870s, where he had done something genuinely unusual. He had tried, with real and documented success, to suppress the slave trade that was the economic backbone of the territory. He was also, by any measure, a religious eccentric, a deeply devout evangelical Christian who believed his military campaigns were directed by providence. He kept detailed notes on biblical prophecy. He believed the Garden of Eden had been located on the island of Praslin in the Seychelles. He believed, at various points in his career, that he was receiving direct divine guidance on military decisions. The Victorian press needed Gordon to be uncomplicated, a Christian hero, a martyr in waiting, a man whose death would mean something clarifying about civilization and its enemies. That is the version that persisted in British popular culture for most of the 20th century. Lytton Strachey, writing in 1,918 inches, eminent Victorians, offered a different portrait. Gordon is a man whose religious intensity had moved him into a region where ordinary military calculation no longer fully operated, where battle outcomes were read as divine signals, and where the gap between personal conviction and strategic reality had ceased to trouble him. The British government sent a man operating inside a prophetic framework to deal with a man operating inside a different one. It is worth pausing on that before moving forward, because the story of Khartoum is often told as a story about heroism and betrayal, or about the clash between civilization and fanaticism, or about Gladstone's failure of political will. All of those framings contain real things, but underneath all of them is something stranger. Two men on the same river, each absolutely certain that history was moving in his direction, each reading the same sequence of military events as confirmation of that certainty. That doesn't make them equivalent. Their positions in the power structure were radically different. The consequences of what they set in motion were radically different. But the structure of their certainty had something in common that is worth examining directly because it tells us something about how prophetic confidence operates in people who, by other measures, are not fools. Gladstone's government did not want to send Gordon. They wanted to get out of Sudan entirely. The Mahdi's control of the interior was, by early 1884, a military reality that further engagement would not easily reverse. The rational policy, as Gladstone's cabinet understood it, was to pull back to Egypt and accept the loss. But the newspapers wanted Gordon, specifically Gordon. Public pressure of the kind that transforms foreign policy from a strategic calculation into a moral performance had reached the point where the government's room for maneuver was effectively gone. Gordon arrived in Khartoum on February 18. His stated orders were to evacuate the Egyptian garrison, roughly 7,000 soldiers and civilians, and withdraw. He did not withdraw. Gordon's decision to stay rather than evacuate has been analyzed for 140 years. He gave various justifications at various times. He believed abandoning the Sudanese population to the Mahdi would be a moral failure. He believed that a determined presence could still alter the strategic picture. And he believed with the particular certainty of someone who had come to read military outcomes as spiritual signals that providence was not finished with him in Khartoum. He also wrote, explicitly and repeatedly, that the Mahdi was not what he claimed to be, that a movement built on religious enthusiasm could not sustain itself against the moral weight of a Christian empire, that the laws of both history and God were on the British side. By May 1884, the Mahdi's forces had cut the telegraph lines and surrounded the city. The siege was complete. Gordon was inside with roughly 7,000 people, a weakening garrison, and his own certainty that something would change. Gordon kept a journal throughout the siege. It was recovered after Khartoum fell and published in 1885, one of the most widely read documents of the Victorian era. The journal is a strange document. He describes enemy positions with professional clarity. He records food inventories, troop dispositions, the state of the fortifications, and then, in the same entry, sometimes on the same page, He shifts into a register that is closer to religious meditation than military analysis. He wrote, "At one point, I declare positively and once for all that I will not leave the Sudan. There is no use. Cairo insisting on it. I cannot abandon this place." And then, a few pages later, I am quite happy. Thank God. And like Lawrence, I have tried to do my duty. He was preparing himself for martyrdom, not with despair, with something closer to satisfaction. This is not the portrait of a man who had lost his grip on reality. Gordon understood the military situation clearly. He knew the food was running out. He knew the relief force might not arrive in time. What he chose, in the face of that knowledge, was to remain inside a framework that made a situation meaningful rather than merely fatal. The city was not just a city. The siege was not just a siege. He was not just a soldier. He was fulfilling something. The Mahdi, meanwhile, was running a state. This tends to get less attention than Gordon's journal. While Gordon was in Khartoum, Muhammad Ahmad had established his capital at Omdurman. Across the Nile, he had created administrative institutions, courts, tax collection, codified religious law, a currency, standardized weights and measures, edicts covering market conduct, dress, the organization of prayers, the apparatus. In other words, of a functioning polity. Historians have debated how stable and effective this administration actually was. Holt's careful scholarship documents both its reach and its significant internal tensions. But what the Mahdi state demonstrated, at minimum, was that the movement Muhammad Ahmad had built was not simply a religious uprising. It was an attempt to build something, to fill the administrative vacuum left by the collapse of Turco-Egyptian authority with institutions that derived their legitimacy from a different source. The Mahdi also issued a proclamation addressed to Gordon directly, a letter, which survives, urging Gordon to submit not in the military sense, but in the religious sense, to recognize the authority of the expected Mahdi. To convert, Gordon refused. He wrote back that he recognized no authority but God's and the Khedive's, and that the Mahdi was neither. Two men in adjacent cities on the same river, each holding a framework that told him the other was wrong about the most important question. The relief force was real. Gladstone's government had authorized it under the kind of public pressure that turns foreign policy into theater. Every newspaper was running Gordon. The government was being accused, in terms that brooked no ambiguity, of abandoning a Christian hero to his fate. The force moved up the Nile. It was well-equipped, well-staffed, including some of the best units in the British Army. It moved slowly, because the Fourth Cataract requires boats to be hauled over rapids, because the desert heat is extreme, because logistics across 600 miles of hostile terrain takes time that armies and newspapers are not required to account for. It moved too slowly. By December 1884, Gordon's journal entries were counting the food remaining in the city. By January 1885, they were recording starvation. The garrison was eating donkeys, then horses, then gum Arabic dissolved in water. January 26. Etem Baba Bashawu, 4 in the morning. The Mahdi's forces found a gap in the defenses on the south side, a section of wall undermined by the falling level of the Nile. And they came through. Gordon was killed on the palace steps. The precise circumstances of his death are disputed, as they have been since 1885. What is agreed, he did not escape. He did not surrender. He died in Khartoum. The relief force arrived 2 days later. In London, the news arrived as a national catastrophe. Gladstone's government, as we noted at the start of this episode, fell within months. The press turned his initials into an accusation. In Omdurman, Gordon's death was received differently. It was read, within the framework Muhammad Ahmad had built, as the latest confirmation of what the prophecy had been saying all along, that the Mahdi would prevail. What came after is a different story in many ways, but it grows directly from this one. The martyr narrative that crystallized around Gordon's death in 1885 did not dissipate. It was kept alive by the press, by the political opposition, by the particular emotional charge that British public culture attached to the idea of a Christian soldier abandoned to his fate. It provided the moral vocabulary for everything that followed. When Kitchener finally marched up the Nile in 1896, 13 years later, he was officially avenging Gordon. When the Battle of Omdurman was fought in 1898, when the Mahdi state was destroyed and Sudan came under British administration, the justification that resonated with the British public was not strategic interest or imperial ambition. It was Gordon. Gordon died as a soldier. He was processed by the press and the public and the political class that needed him into something more durable. A narrative about what the British Empire was and why its presence in Sudan was right. The Mahdist movement had used a prophetic claim to build a state. The British Empire used the martyr to justify retaking it. These are not the same thing in their origins, in the power they wielded, in the consequences they produced. The Mahdi was a man without an army trying to end an occupation. The empire that avenged Gordon was the most powerful military and economic force on earth. The moral weight of those positions is not equivalent, and flattening them into a single analytical pattern would be a distortion. But there is something they share that is worth naming. Both sides, in the aftermath of January 26, Itzhembabai Bashawu took a specific military outcome and placed it inside a framework that made it mean something beyond itself. Both sides needed the battle to be about more than tactics and food supplies and a gap in a wall. Understanding that doesn't erase the differences. It sharpens them because it asks us to notice that the need to narrate history as prophecy is not a feature of the weak or the desperate. It is available to the powerful too. Sometimes more so. The Mahdi died 5 months after Khartoum fell. His 4 years are worth sitting with. He declared himself the Mahdi in 1881 with 300 followers and spears. He died in 1885, having expelled the Egyptian administration from all of Sudan and killed the most famous general in the British Empire. 4 years, from River Island to colonial capital, with no external support. No formal military training. No diplomatic recognition. He also died before the hardest part began. He never had to deal with the budget. Never had to negotiate the tobacco ban with people who were angry about it. Never had to manage a famine or a failed military campaign. He got to be the prophetic leader who wins, and then he died. And he left the winning to someone else. Muhammad Ahmed died at 40. June 22. Itzhembabai Bashawu, probably of typhus. Now what? The answer fell to a man named Abdallahi ibn Muhammad, known as the Khalifa. The successor. Abdallahi was not from the learned, scholarly Nile Valley background that had produced Muhammad Ahmad. He was from the Baggara people of the western Sudan cattle herders. Fighters. He had been one of the Mahdi's earliest and most loyal followers. Present from the first days on Abba Island, he ruled the Mahdi's state for 13 years, until the British returned in 1898. Those 13 years are one of the more illuminating stretches in what happens when a prophetic movement has to actually be a government. The Mahdi state was, by any honest account, a difficult place to live. Here is a specific example. The Mahdi had banned the smoking of tobacco in his interpretation of pure Islamic practice, a corruption imported from non-Muslim cultures. Tobacco had been, for centuries, one of the primary social lubricants of Sudanese life, traded along the Nile, smoked in public and private, a normal feature of daily interaction across communities with different relationships to formal religious observance. The ban was enforced. People caught smoking faced flogging. Traders who dealt in tobacco lost their livelihoods. This is a small example, but it illustrates something important. The Mahdi state was applying a vision of purified practice to a society that had developed its own traditions over centuries. The vision was sincere. Muhammad Ahmad and the Khalifa genuinely believed that corrupted practice was what had brought the Muslim world to its current condition. But the specific content of what counted as corruption was contested, and had always been contested within Islamic jurisprudence. What looked like restoration of the true faith from one angle looked like imposition of a particular regional interpretation from another. The gap between the prophetic promise and the daily reality of living inside the state that the prophecy produced was something any Sudanese farmer could feel, whether they articulated it in those terms or not. Rudolf von Slatin was an Austrian officer who served the Egyptian administration and was captured by the Mahdi's forces in 1883. He spent 11 years as a prisoner in Omdurman. His memoir, Fire and Sword in the Sudan, published after his escape in 1895, is a complicated document he was writing for a British audience that wanted to read about barbarism, and his account reflects those pressures in ways that historians have had to account for carefully. But embedded within it are observations more textured than the genre required. Slatin describes the Khalifa as a shrewd, hard-working ruler who understood the political forces he was managing with real sophistication. The court at Omdurman, the daily meetings, the petitions, the management of tribal rivalries, the constant negotiation between the demands of the prophetic framework and the practical requirements of governing a large territory is described by a man who observed it from unusual proximity, and who was not always trying to be fair but sometimes couldn't help being accurate. He also describes a state that was economically extractive, militarily punishing, and increasingly unable to provide the justice the prophetic mission had promised. The gap between the prophecy and the reality was widening. Unlike the administrators of more powerful states with access to modern mass media, the Khalifa had no sophisticated propaganda apparatus to manage public perception. He had the mosque and the street. He had the authority of the Mahdi's memory and the genuine belief of a substantial portion of the population that the divine mandate remained real even when conditions were hard. It turned out that was enough. For 13 years, in 1889, the Khalifa sent a force of approximately 60,000 men into Egypt to carry the Mahdist revolution northward, to fulfill the movement's promise that it would not stop at Sudan's border. The invasion was repelled at the Battle of Toski in August 1889. It was a significant military defeat. The Khalifa did not acknowledge Toski as a defeat. He acknowledged it as a temporary setback, a test, requiring the faithful to redouble their commitment rather than question the mission. This is worth noting as a pattern. When a movement organized around prophetic certainty encounters a clear disconfirmation, the most common response is not revision but reframing. The setback is absorbed as a trial, a purification. Evidence not that the prophecy is wrong, but that the faithful need to be more committed. This is not unique to the Khalifa. It appears across the history of millenarian movements in many traditions. What varies is how long the reframing can hold before the material costs of maintaining the belief become too large. For the Mahdi state, the reframing held for nearly a decade after Toski. In 1896, the British government decided to reconquer Sudan, less about Sudan specifically than about the broader geopolitics of the scramble for Africa. France was pushing into Central Africa. The British needed to secure the Nile watershed to protect Egypt and the Suez Canal. Gordon's martyrdom provided the moral vocabulary. Nile Valley geopolitics provided the actual reason. The general chosen was Horatio Kitchener. His approach was methodical in a way Gordon's had specifically not been. He built a railway into the desert as he advanced, so supply lines would not be the limiting factor. He moved slowly, ensuring each position was secured before advancing. He was not interested in being a hero. He was interested in winning. You can build a prophetic narrative fast. You cannot build a railway fast. His force reached Omdurman in September 1898. On September 2, the Mahdist army made its final stand. The Mahdist forces numbered approximately 60,000 men, armed largely with weapons captured in the campaigns of the 1880s, 15-year-old rifles, spears, swords. Kitchener's force had approximately 25,000 men and 20 Maxim machine guns. The Maxim gun had been developed in 1884, the first fully automatic weapon in the world, capable of firing 600 rounds per minute. The battle lasted approximately 5 hours. Approximately 11,000 Mahdist soldiers were killed. Kitchener's force lost 47 men. Winston Churchill was there. He was 23 years old, a cavalry lieutenant, and he had brought a camera. He wrote about it in his first book, The River War, his account of the Mahdist charge. It was not a battle, but an execution. The men were destroyed, not defeated. They fell by thousands. The valiant and devoted followers of the Khalifa obeyed the commands of their Emir with a courage that no living observer can dispute. And they died. Churchill was not celebrating. He was noting a specific quality of what he had witnessed. The Mahdist soldiers were not fighting badly. They were fighting with the specific kind of courage that comes from people who genuinely believe in what they're fighting for. They charged into machine gun fire because the prophetic framework told them they would prevail. They fell because machine gun fire does not recognize prophetic frameworks. Churchill's account of Omdurman also described the treatment of the wounded and the demolition of the Mahdi's tomb. This description cost him his relationship with Kitchener and created lasting tension with the military establishment. He was documenting the gap between what the British Empire said it was doing in Sudan, bringing civilization, avenging Gordon, and what it actually did in the hours after the battle was won. The Mahdi state had held for 15 years against the most powerful empire in the world. It was not sufficient against 600 rounds per minute. Kitchener demolished the Mahdi's tomb. Think about that decision. Kitchener was a practical man, methodical and unsentimental throughout the campaign. He demolished the tomb immediately after the battle, before any administration was established, before the political questions were decided. Why? Because he understood something about how prophetic movements persist. A claim that has been physically embodied, that has a tomb, a shrine, a place where the faithful can gather and renew the belief, is harder to extinguish than a claim that exists only in memory and text. A tomb was, among other things, a technology for maintaining the living reality of the prophecy. Kitchener wanted to destroy the technology. It worked, partially, for a while. The Khalifa escaped from Omdurman and was not captured until November 1899. More than a year after the battle, he was killed, still fighting. At the Battle of Waikarat, he had continued fighting in the name of the prophecy for 14 months after the battle that destroyed his army. With a force that dwindled from thousands to hundreds to dozens, he did not surrender. With his death, the Mahdi state was officially over. Sudan became the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, jointly administered by Britain and Egypt, which in practice meant British administration with Egyptian letterhead. Here is what Kitchener did not fully account for. You can demolish a tomb. You cannot demolish the expectation that produced it. The Mahdi's prophecy was not a building. It was a belief embedded in centuries of religious tradition, transmitted through family, community. The recitation of the relevant hadith in mosques from Morocco to Indonesia. It was in the text. It was in the memory. It was in the lived experience of a population that had watched a boat builder's son from a river island hold a colonial empire at bay for 15 years. That experience does not disappear because a new administration has taken the capital. In Sudan specifically, the memory of the Mahdi state did not fade the way colonial powers typically expected local resistance movements to fade. The Khalifa's defeat was not experienced as proof that the Mahdi had been wrong. It was experienced by much of the Sudanese population as a setback within a longer arc that remained unfinished. The Mahdi had been real. The movement had been real. The defeat was a chapter, not the conclusion. The Ansar survived. The movement reorganized under Muhammad Ahmad's descendants and became one of the two dominant political forces in 20th century Sudanese politics. The Ummah Party, which represented the Ansar tradition, traced its lineage directly to Muhammad Ahmad's movement, not as folklore, but as active political identity. Sadiq al-Mahdi, the great-grandson of Muhammad Ahmad, served as Prime Minister of Sudan in 1966-67, and again in 1986-89. Elected, not appointed. Running on a platform that connected his policy positions to the legacy of his great-grandfather. The prophetic claim made on a river island in 1881 was still organizing votes in Sudan's capital city 108 years later. In April 2013, Sudan's longtime president Omar al-Bashir was removed from power by a military coup, following months of popular protests. The political coalition that organized the protests included the Ummah Party led at the time by Sadiq al-Mahdi. He died in November 2020 of COVID-19 at the age of 84, still active in Sudanese politics in the final year of his life. Sudan is currently in a devastating civil conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces. Omdurman itself has been a site of fighting. The Mahdi's tomb, rebuilt by the Mahdist community in the 20th century after Kitchener demolished the original, has been damaged in the conflict. The city that Muhammad Ahmad built as the capital of the prophetic state is, again, a vast zone. What began on Aba Island in 1881 is not history in the sense of something finished. It is history in the sense of something that is still happening. Kitchener demolished the tomb in September 1898. The Mahdist community rebuilt it in the 20th century. The dome stands again today in Omdurman white, maintained, a site of pilgrimage. The British Empire that demolished it no longer exists. The British Empire lasted from roughly the 16th century to the mid-20th. The Mahdist tradition has been present in the Nile Valley for longer than the formal political entity that tried to erase it. This is not a triumphalist observation. It is a historical one. Prophetic movements that are rooted in genuine grievances and embedded in deep religious tradition are not extinguished by military defeat. They are transformed. They go underground, or they reorganize, or they find political expression in forms that the original movement's founders might not recognize. The Khalifa would not easily recognize the Ummah Party. Muhammad Ahmad might not have approved of electoral politics at all, but the lineage runs. The claim persists. Empires end. The movements they try to extinguish are sometimes still there when the empires are gone. Episode 2 showed you the full industrial scale. Speer's architecture, Riefenstahl's cameras, Goebbels' propaganda apparatus, the Hitler Youth reaching 90% of eligible German youth, the entire aesthetic and organizational infrastructure of a modern totalitarian state deployed in service of a prophetic claim about national destiny. That is the claim at maximum amplification. The Mahdi had none of that. He had a prophecy that was already in the text, not invented by him, but waiting in a tradition 12 centuries old. He had a population under genuine colonial oppression with genuine grievances. He had his own conviction, which was absolute and, by all accounts, contagious. and he had a series of military victories that meant something to people who were already looking for signs. No searchlights, no cameras, no printing press, and he held the world's largest empire at bay for 15 years. Before going further, the comparison needs to be stated carefully because the risk here is flattening what should not be flattened. These three cases share a structural pattern, a gap, a prophetic claim, an initial confirmation that sets the belief running, a mechanism for absorbing setbacks as further proof. That structural similarity is analytically useful, but the moral and political content could not be more different. The 1,000-year Reich was the ideology of a state conducting genocide. Manifest destiny was a doctrine deployed by a dominant power to dispossess peoples with less power. The Mahdist movement was a colonial resistance, people with less power, using the resources available to them, against an occupation that was extracting their labor and ignoring their lives. Noting that all three share a structural pattern is not a claim that they are morally equivalent. It is a claim that the same underlying architecture appears in very different hands, with very different consequences, and that understanding the architecture is not the same as equating the cases. The Mahdi's case is in this series precisely because it demonstrates something the other cases don't. The same structure working from below, against power, for a population with genuine cause. That doesn't make the Mahdist state a paradise. Hoi3 covered what daily life actually looked like inside it. But the moral position of a colonized people resisting occupation is not the same as the moral position of a state killing millions. And treating them as equivalent because the underlying structure has similarities would be a serious distortion. What the Mahdist case contributes to this season's argument is something more specific than the general pattern. It demonstrates the minimum conditions. The claim doesn't need spear. It needs a gap that is real, a space between what people have been promised and what they actually experience, and a framework for filling it that already exists in the culture. It needs one person willing to make the claim, with enough conviction that others find it credible. And it needs a few early moments where the claim appears to be working, where the world seems to confirm rather than contradict the prophecy. After those conditions are met, the claim tends to run itself. The people who have committed to it interpret subsequent events through it. Victories confirm it. Defeats require more commitment rather than less. The framework becomes the lens through which experience is organized. And changing the lens means dismantling the framework that has been organizing your understanding of the world. That is a significant psychological cost. Most people don't pay it voluntarily. The only consistent pattern in how prophetic movements end is time and accumulated cost. When the gap between what the prophecy promised and what life inside the movement actually provides becomes too large to manage, when the material costs of staying inside the framework exceed the social and psychological costs of leaving people leave, the movement shrinks. The prophecy is revised, or abandoned, or preserved as cultural memory rather than operational force. This is a slow process. It took 13 years for the Khalifa's state to be militarily defeated. It took decades more for the Mahdist political tradition to transform from a millenarian movement into a conventional political party. The transformation is still ongoing for the Mahdist state. The military defeat came from the specific technology of 1898, a weapon that made the gap between divine appointment and the physical reality of battle too wide to bridge by any available reframing. The Mahdist soldiers charged into machine gun fire because the prophecy said they would prevail. The machine gun had no relationship to the prophecy. It simply fired. But the prophecy outlasted the state. It outlasted the empire that destroyed the state. It is present in Sudanese political life today. Muhammad Ahmad was a boat builder's son from a river island. He had no army, no state, no printing press, no architecture, no film crew. He had a prophecy that 12 centuries had been building toward. He had a gap that was real, and an oppression that was real. and a population that had been waiting for someone to name what they were living through and point towards something beyond it. He stepped into the gap and made the claim. The British Empire spent 15 years trying to stop what happened next. Here's the question this season keeps returning to. If the claim can run with almost nothing, what do you think it can do with everything?